Hello, everybody. We are here today in this very special lecture where we're going to have as a special guest, Steve Horwitz. And he's presenting to us today his great book that he just launched that is named Austrian Economics. So for us as Francisco Marroquin members, for me as the Dean of the School of Economics, it's an honor to have you here. And well, I hope that all of you enjoy this great opportunity of hearing from the author, the main learnings, the main ideas, and the main principles that he communicates in his book. And having you here at this very important moment of the process of launching the book is a great thing for us. So thank you, Steve, for being with us. And I will leave Clinton Lopez, that he is in charge of the economics department in the School of Economics, to introduce him today. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Steve. I'm going to introduce Steve Horwitz, a good friend and a great professor of Austrian Economics. And the presentation is going to be like first a presentation of the book for Professor Horwitz for 45 minutes more or less. And after that, we're going to have a very good amount of time for Q&A. You can write the questions in the chat, or we are going to have time for to ask personally to Steve. Then I'm going to start with the CV. Professor Steve Horwitz is a distinguished professor of free enterprise, director of Institute for Study of Political Economy, and he works in the Miller College Business, Vail State University. He got his PhD from George Mason University, a Doctor of Philosophy in Economics, and he had a master's degree in economics in George Mason University too, and his BA in the University of Michigan, with distinction in economics and philosophy. Welcome, Professor Horwitz, to present your book, Austrian Economics, an Introduction.
Well, thank you, Clinton, and thank all of you for coming. I'm just glanced down to see that there's 114 participants, which is terrific. I'm very happy to be part of this. We were just talking before. I've never been down to UFM, and it's one of the great sort of missed opportunities of my career. And hopefully, down the road when things open back up and everybody's healthy, I can come down there in person. But this is still, for me, this is still a great opportunity for me to talk about the book and talk about Austrian economics to one of the most awesome places on earth. So thank you all for coming today. I appreciate it. So I'm going to share my screen and my PowerPoint in just a moment. Let me just say a couple things about this talk. So the talk is a talk about Austrian economics. In fact, I'll go ahead and share the screen. And so the talk is a sort of general talk about Austrian economics. Come on, hang on one second. We had this working just fine before. There it is. That's what I wanted. Okay. This is a general talk about Austrian economics that I've done before, but I want to frame it in terms of this new book, okay? And say a little bit about the book and how the book came to be, and then we'll talk about the sort of main ideas behind the talk. So my title of my talk officially is What Austrian Economics Is and Is Not, and we'll as I said, we'll think about that in terms of the book, which again a couple people have mentioned already. The book is Austrian Economics Introduction. It's published by the libertarianism.org project of the Cato Institute. What's cool is you can get it for free. You can download a free copy online by going to libertarianism.org. The link should be up there on the screen, but you can go to libertarianism.org. The link there is right on the front page. It's an overview of the Austrian school. It's as the title suggests, it's an introduction. It's designed for non-specialists. Certainly people who are likely to have come to this talk and are at UFM already know enough to sort of very much, I think, get a lot out of it. It sort of is a topical and historical approach at the same time. It is organized historically, but it's not a biography. There's not sort of, I'm not looking at particular sort of talking about Menger, then Mises, then Hayek. It's talking about the ideas and the various debates and the sort of development of those ideas historically through time. And it sort of brings us all the way up to the present, the last A couple chapters deal with the sort of modern Austrian school, things like Austrian business cycle theory and so forth. And in addition to the book, if you go to the website, you can find a whole series of lectures. There's 7 lectures, video lectures that go with the book. They're short. They're about 5 or 6 minutes long each. And so they're certainly, don't take a lot of your time. And anyone who's teaching a course, hopefully those will be really, really useful to use in class. So the book, Cato asked me to write this book. They didn't have they have this series of introductions as part of the libertarianism.org project. There's one on statistics. There's one on free markets. They didn't have one specifically on Austrian economics. So they wanted me to do this. And they particularly were interested in how Austrian economics is similar and different to the mainstream. And so one of the running themes of the book, one of the running ways that I go about talking about the material is to compare what Austrians have to say to what you might find in a typical, say, introduction or intermediate level economics textbook. And I hope anyway, that's a really useful thing for readers. So that's the context of the book. What I want to do today is a couple of things. I want to talk about, again, what Austrian economics is and is not. And I want to start by emphasizing the idea that Austrian economics is not just free market economics. And I think that's an important point we'll talk about. That instead, it's a framework for scientific analysis, for social scientific analysis. Austrian economics is not, despite what some people think, a set of policy conclusions. It's not just free markets are great. And I think that making this distinction matters for how we might influence the world of ideas. That is, how do we persuade people that Austrian economics is the right way, the better way to do economics? I think we have to be really careful in how we argue about that. And so to sort of make that case, I'm going to talk about 10 analytical propositions that define what I think Austrian economics is. And I've stolen these completely from my friend Pete Boettke. If you have read the entry on Austrian economics in the Concise Encyclopedia of Economics, which is also available online, what Pete does there is to sort of lay out these 10 propositions that he thinks are the sort of core ideas of Austrian economics. And I'm going to play with those. And I'm going to divide them up into 3 categories. I'm going to divide them up into methodology or method. How do we go about doing economics? And then I'm going to talk about the ones of those propositions that are about microeconomics, and we'll talk some that are about macroeconomics. And then I'll come back at the end today and talk a little bit more about that relationship between Austrian economics and libertarianism and free markets. Okay, so most of this presentation from here on out, right, is going to be talking about those ideas, those propositions. So what I want to do is I'm going to go through all 10 of these propositions. I'm just going to put up some slides and list them all. And then I'm going to go back through them and sort of organize them in those 3 categories. So I want you to see what all 10 of them are, and then I'm going to come back and bundle them together. Okay? So here are the 10 propositions, the methodology propositions. Proposition 1, only individuals choose. Okay, we'll talk about what that means. Proposition 2, the study of the market order is fundamentally about exchange behavior and the institutions within which exchange takes place. And we'll talk about what each of these means in just a couple minutes. The third methodology proposition is that the facts of the social sciences are what people believe and think. If you know the idea of subjectivism, that's just another way of putting the idea of subjectivism. So those are the 3 methodology propositions. What about microeconomics? Utility and cost are subjective. That's really important, and we'll talk about why. Proposition number 5, the price system economizes on information because prices are knowledge surrogates. And this is an idea that we find in Hayek, and I would argue it's in Mises too, just not as clearly. It's certainly in Hayek, and a key idea that undergirds much of what Austrians like to talk about. Number 6, private property and the means of production is a necessary condition for rational economic calculation. If you know a little bit of Austrian economics, you'll recognize this from Mises' 1920 article on economic calculation and his book on socialism. And then the competitive market process is competitive market is a process of entrepreneurial discovery. And again, if you know a little bit of Austrian economics, you can hear Kirzner there, and Kirzner's work, again, that too coming out of things that are in Mises. So those 4 are the 4 for microeconomics. What about macroeconomics? And I should say something here because sometimes people think Austrian macroeconomics is a contradiction in terms, that there's no such thing. And I'm not going to sort of argue this at length, but I think that's wrong. I wrote a whole book on Austrian macroeconomics, and certainly Roger Garrison's work on Austrian macroeconomics is important here too. And there's a whole younger generation of Austrians doing work on monetary theory and capital and so on. So it's not the same macroeconomics that we think of in the mainstream, sort of the Keynesian or the sort of aggregate demand, C plus I plus G stuff, but it is a macroeconomics in the sense that what Austrians are interested in is understanding how money and capital can have system-wide, economy-wide effects. So what are the three macroeconomic propositions? Money is non-neutral, that is, money affects the real economy. Number 9, the capital structure consists of heterogeneous goods that have multi-specific uses that must be aligned. There's a lot packed into that sentence, and we'll unpack it in a little bit. But that capital is very important, and that capital is not just a sort of homogeneous quantity we label K or something like that. That rather it's about the particular goods that people use in the market process. And then proposition 10, social institutions are often the result of human action, but not of human design. That is, social institutions, the word we would use, of course, are spontaneous orders. And we'll talk some more about that as we go along too. So those are the 10 propositions. Now I want to take some time and explore them in some more depth and see what we can make of them. So let's first talk about some of the microeconomic ones. In particular, we can talk about the ideas of cost and choice and how they work together. So if we look at proposition 1 and proposition 4 together, only individuals choose, and utility and cost are subjective. And notice, right, that only individuals choose says something about Austrian method, how we do things, and that utility and cost are subjective is how we go about, in particular, doing microeconomics. Proposition 1, that only individuals choose, sometimes we hear called methodological individualism. And that's a perfectly good name for it too. The idea here is that we often hear people say things like firms or governments or households or even societies make choices, right? That government made a choice to do this, or society made a choice to do that. The public chooses to do this or that. One of the things that Austrians emphasize, and this is true of mainstream economics as well, of course, is that at the end of the day, only individuals choose. When we say things like Walmart raised prices or the government spent more money, what we really mean is that people within those institutions, the people who manage Walmart and politicians in the case of government, they made choices. Those individuals made choices, the result of which was Walmart raised prices or government spent more, okay? Social science and economics in particular has to start with individuals and their choices. That's where it all begins. The first thing we do is to ask, how do individuals choose? What influences those choices? How do they make those choices? And then we trace out the consequences of those choices from there, both the intended consequences and the unintended consequences. All right? And in particular, what we're interested in, and again, this is something we'll talk a bit more about in a little bit, we're interested in how those particular choices play out under different sets of institutions. Or sometimes we say different rules of the game. That's really important, right? Because how we choose, what we're able to choose, and the consequences of those choices will differ when we have different rules of the game, when different rules about property or different rules about contract and so on. It's important also to understand that when we say things like only individuals choose, or we have to start with individual choice, that doesn't mean that social groups or firms or government don't matter or in some sense don't exist. They do exist and they're important. But when we break down what their influence is, what is it that they do, we have to understand that first and foremost in terms of how they are the results of individual choice. So they matter, right? Things like families matter. But we have to understand them, understand the ways in which those are the products, again, perhaps the unintended products of individual choice. All of this is a version of what Austrians talk about, again, as subjectivism. Okay, and I think that's all understanding of human action begins with our perception, the actor's perception of our context of choice. what we believe about the world, what we expect to happen in the world, that's what determines our choices. And that's where choice begins. And so if we want to understand how economies operate, how price controls cause problems, how whatever it is that we want to look at, we have to start by understanding the choices people make and the options they perceive in front of themselves. That's the beginning. That subjectivism is the core to the Austrian story. And so when we talk about utility and cost, we have to think in terms of this notion of subjectivism. With utility, right, what's important to understand here is that it is our judgment about the usefulness of a good or how well it will satisfy a want that determines its utility or its marginal utility. And an important difference with mainstream economics here, and this is one of the video lectures, by the way, I think it's lecture number 7 if you have a chance to watch them, is that utility for Austrians is not a feeling. It's not, sometimes when we teach this, we talk about, you get utility from eating cake and the cake tastes good and you have more pieces of cake and you get marginal utility eventually declines. And we make it sound like utility is a feeling. It's how something tastes or whatever, but that's not it at all, right? For Austrians, utility is simply about the ability of a good to satisfy a want, or a service to satisfy a want. The example I like to use is going to the dentist. Nobody really, most people anyway, don't think going to the dentist feels good, but it has utility for us to the extent that going to the dentist can fix a toothache or can prevent us from having problems. So utility is about satisfying wants. And when we talk about marginal utility, what we're talking about is the ability of a particular good in a particular time and place to satisfy a particular specific want. Right? And a gallon of water, what's the marginal utility of water? It's the utility of this particular amount of water at this particular place and time to satisfy a particular want that we might have. I think that's really important, that utility for Austrians is a judgment about want fulfillment, about the ability to satisfy our wants. And that's a different thing often than the way utility gets taught, which is, again, sort of like a feeling. And that's not the way Austrians think about it. And once you understand that utility is subjective in this way, you can see why subjective cost is so important. And the book here I would recommend, if you've never read it, is Buchanan's Cost and Choice. It's a short little book. It's the best introduction to thinking about cost in this way. And the key is that only individuals choose, and only choosers know the cost of their actions. When we think about opportunity cost, we usually talk about the thing we gave up, right? The choice the foregone choice. And for Austrians, that's true, but it's not nearly enough. What opportunity cost really is for Austrians is the subjective expected utility of the next best alternative. If you go to a restaurant and order dinner and you can't decide whether you should have steak or fish, okay? And suppose you decide to have steak. What's your opportunity cost? The opportunity cost is the subjective expected utility that you thought you would have gotten from the fish. The interesting thing about that is you never know exactly what your opportunity cost is because you don't actually order the fish and you don't taste it, right? You eat the steak and you never know for sure what it is that you gave up. When we choose, what choice is for Austrians is sort of getting over that hurdle, is deciding steak or fish. Which one do I think will make me, will better satisfy that want? Which one will satisfy my hunger and make satisfy my desire for something that tastes good? And we have to sort of convince ourselves, right? You're sitting there looking at the menu saying steak or fish. You persuade ourselves that one is better to the other. And we do that by comparing the subjective expected utilities of each. But we never know for sure what our opportunity cost is. And when I use this example, my wife always says, then how come you always want to taste whatever it is that I get at the restaurants? Well, that's the one way that we can know what our opportunity cost is, right? If you ordered the thing I might have ordered instead, at least I get a sense of whether I made the right decision or not. So utility and costs are subjective. And that's important, right? When we talk about the cost of something, we don't just mean the monetary cost. We mean, what are we giving up? What are we sacrificing in order to get the thing that we want? And that leads us naturally into thinking about institutions and exchange, okay? And proposition 2, right, was that the study of the market order is fundamentally about, again, this exchange behavior and the institutions within which exchange takes place. And I want to say a little bit about this because I think it's particularly important for understanding what Austrians are doing today, okay? So once we decide to choose, how do we, and sort of decide to try to improve our situation and satisfy our wants, what do? Well, exchange is one way we do that. We trade with people because we think the thing that they have will better satisfy our wants than the thing that we have, whether it's money or goods for goods or whatever it might be. And so exchange is the fundamental aspect of human economic interaction. And Hayek referred to the economy as a catalaxy, right? And that word catalaxy is the Greek root of that word means to exchange. It also means, by the way, to change from an enemy into a friend and to admit into the community. And I think that's kind of really cool, right? That when we think about exchange as being ways that we turn enemies into friends and we admit people into our community by exchanging with them, by recognizing the interdependencies of exchange. Exchange, again, is the foundation of economics because it's the way in which we attempt to better satisfy our wants. We know from the beginning of economics the idea that trade is mutually beneficial. Note how that's a subjectivism point too. When we trade, we think we're getting something that we value more than the thing that we're giving up. And to be precise, for Austrians, what that means is we think that the want that will be satisfied by the thing that we're getting is a more important want, more valuable want to us than the want that we would have satisfied with the thing that we're giving up. But how well trade works in this way, how well trade does this, and how effective exchange is will depend upon the institutions under which that exchange is taking place. Some rules and some institutions will make exchange be more effective and make mutual trades more easy. Other rules and other institutions won't. For example, the most obvious one is broad protections of private property and enforcement of contracts encourage trade. Discretionary political power doesn't, or the socialization or nationalization of property doesn't. And for Austrians, this relationship between what we sometimes call the rules of the game and how exchange takes place within those rules, that's the core of economic analysis. And a couple of things to notice here. One, notice that this does not say, right? Austrians don't believe that self-interest always leads to good results. Sometimes people like to sort of portray that economists, or Austrian economists in particular, believe that greed is always good, that self-interest is always good, or that's what Adam Smith was saying with the invisible hand. But that's not true, right? Even it's very clear in Smith and certainly clear elsewhere too. Self-interest, pursuing our self-interest through exchange only works well if the rules of the game are right, if we have the right institutions like private property and contract and sound money, the rule of law, all these sorts of things. So without those things, right, pursuing self-interest is not going to be particularly effective. So it's never about self-interest alone. It's about how well do the institutions of society, the rules of the game, enable people to pursue their self-interest in ways that benefit other people. Right? That's the key question. And this is important because it also shows why Austrian economics is compatible with, and sort of people who are interested in Austrian economics also tend to be interested in public choice economics and the work of people like James Buchanan, because what Buchanan is doing is trying to understand how political exchange takes place and how exchange works out under the rules of the game of politics. It's the same sort of analysis. He's just looking at a different set of rules and a different set of institutions and see how things work there. And so I think that's a really an important insight to understanding why Austrians are, and especially modern Austrians, are interested in public choice economics. I would say too that it also explains why they're interested in the work of Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom, who looked at even a third set of rules, which is how do communities, when they're not using the market or they're not using the state, how do communities develop norms and practices that help solve certain kinds of problems that aren't easily solved in other sorts of ways. Rules and institutions frame exchange and determine what its consequences will be. And that's an important sort of way that Austrians approach the world. Another set of issues here, another way we can organize these propositions is to think in terms of the relationship among prices, knowledge, and private property. And you sort of think about some of the propositions that we put up there earlier, and you can kind of see what might go here, right? This, for me, these two, and this issue is the sort of core of Austrian economics. This is the particular sort of unique Austrian insight that I think defines the school in many ways. And in terms of how it understands microeconomics, is especially, this is especially powerful. So 5, the price system, again, economizes on information because prices are knowledge surrogates, and then private property is necessary for economic calculation. So how might we sort of flesh all this out? I think the best way to think about it for me is to think once we have people buying and selling, right? We've talked about exchange and the rules under which it takes place. Once they start to buy and sell and they're using money to do it, we start to see the emergence of prices, okay? And what those prices, what market prices do is to reflect the preferences, the judgments, the knowledge of all those buyers and sellers in the marketplace. By watching prices move, we don't need to know all of the reasons why a good has become more scarce or why people's preferences have changed. It doesn't matter. We don't have to know all that detail. What we can do is watch the way prices move, and by looking at that and interpreting it, we're able to make decisions almost as if we knew what they knew, right? If we didn't have a price system, we'd need to have some other way to access this knowledge. As Hayek says, the problem of society is not just a problem about the division of labor, but of the division of knowledge. We each know different things. We each have partial knowledge, and our knowledge is, as we've talked about, subjective. And so the question for the sort of question of social institutions that all societies must answer is, how do we mobilize that knowledge? How do we make our individual knowledge available to other people? That's the key. And it's even trickier, right, when we recognize that some of the knowledge we have, if not a good hunk of the knowledge we have that's relevant for economic interaction, is what we call inarticulate or tacit knowledge. It's things that we know that we can't quite explain to people. My favorite example of this is, and this works better, by the way, with non-American audiences, I think, because Americans these days, everybody drives an automatic transmission car, but in other parts of the world, right, stick shift, manual transmission is much more common. And if you've ever driven a car with a stick shift and a clutch, right, ask yourself this question: how do you know when it's okay to pull your foot off the clutch? Right, you shift gears. How do you know when it's okay to pull your foot off the clutch? If you've ever tried to teach someone how to drive with a clutch, right, that's the trickiest part. Is they say, well, how do I know when to pull off the clutch? And what do? You say, you just know. You feel it, right? You can't articulate it, but you know it. If you're an athlete or a musician, you know this too, right? You can't always explain how you did that thing when you were playing tennis or playing basketball. Or the musicians can't quite explain, right, what it is that they understood, and especially jazz musicians who improvise. We all have this inarticulate knowledge. Entrepreneurs have this knowledge too, so do consumers, right? And all of these things, all of that knowledge, which we can't really put into statistics or data or even words, when we buy and sell, we put that knowledge out into play in the marketplace, and prices become surrogates, become reflections of that knowledge, and prices enable us to act as if we were able to communicate that. What prices do is turn subjective knowledge into accessible knowledge. And sometimes the way I like to put this is, which I stole from some other economists, is that prices are knowledge wrapped in an incentive, or an incentive wrapped in knowledge, if you want to look at it that way too. That prices not only, and mainstream economists recognize that prices provide incentives for people, but what Austrians emphasize is they also provide knowledge. They also give us information about people's preferences and about scarcities and so on. What Mises did in 1920, in his paper on economic calculation, is to basically say, look, the only way prices can do this is if you have private property in the means of production. That you need prices to serve as the basis for calculating revenues and costs, calculating profits and losses. That's the only way. If you need those things to be able to allocate resources rationally, effectively. And the only way you're going to get prices that reflect people's preferences and costs and so on, the only way profits and losses are going to tell you something important is if you have private property and people are really engaging in exchange with their own resources. And in particular, because he was concerned about the Marxists at the time, private property in capital goods and the means of production was especially important. The problem we face as a society isn't just figuring out what people want. It's figuring out that, plus how do we make what people want with the least valuable resources possible? How do we do that most efficiently? And that is what the price system, including profits and losses, help us do. And notice, right, people hear this and they say, oh, well, that's just free market stuff. This isn't just a kind of ideological political claim. It's a social scientific claim. It's a claim about the nature of how markets work and about what prices and profits and losses do. And I think when you start to think about profits this way, right, it's also an important sort of thing to understand that profits aren't just, you know, the guys who own the property taking things from the workers, right? So it's not just exploitation. Profits have an important social function to play in providing us with this information and incentive to figure out how best to make things, and in particular, to help us when we get it wrong, because prices and profits and losses aren't perfect. People aren't perfect. We make mistakes all the time. And the key is that in a market economy, because prices and profits and losses reflect all this knowledge, and we have the knowledge and incentive available to us, when we make mistakes, we have a way of correcting them. We have a way of fixing them. So it's important also to understand the Austrians weren't saying that markets are perfect and that prices always help us get things exactly right. To the contrary, the Austrians were very much interested in disequilibrium and so on. But the argument was that prices, profits in a genuine market with private property and exchange are better than any other set of institutions at telling us when we've made a mistake, helping us understand what that mistake might have been, and giving us the incentive to correct it. It's the way in which markets help us learn, that markets are social learning processes. That's really key to the Austrian argument. It's not that markets get it perfect, it's that it's a way for us to learn. This also, I think, is interesting to think about in terms of the way economists frequently talk about the idea of market failure. For Austrians, right, markets in some sense fail all the time. They're never perfect. The question isn't whether markets fail. The question is, are they better than the alternatives, right? And how well do markets work compared to not having markets? And you can see, by the way, here's another way in which markets and Austrian economics and public choice economics are compatible, because Austrians will talk about this sort of idea of comparison, and public choice helps us understand the same kinds of questions within the political process. How well do the signals of the political process, the institutions of the political process, how well do they help us know that we've made mistakes? How do they help us correct them? Well do they guide us to results that benefit people in all kinds of ways? So you can see, again, asking very similar sorts of questions there. And I think I would just add there that the socialist calculation debate that Mises started in 1920 is one of the most important things to understand, not just in Austrian economics, but really in all of the social sciences. The issues that were raised there are central to understanding how societies work and why markets do what they do. If you have not seen, I'm sure you guys have, but if you have not seen the Marx versus Mises hip hop video from the guys who did the Keynes and Hayek one, you should make sure that you see that. Someone I'm sure can link it in the chat box. It's terrific, and it really gets to the heart of these issues in the same sort of fun way that the Hayek Keynes macro hip hop rap videos did too. So that, I think, is another important set of issues here, this whole set of issues around prices, knowledge, and private property. What I also think is important there too is it helps us understand how the ideas of both Mises and Hayek work together, okay, to help us understand all of these processes. Okay, so what other areas of focus might we talk about? Okay, money, inflation, deflation, the macroeconomic stuff. Now, this, of course, is my area of specialty within Austrian economics, so it's always fun for me to talk about these things. So let me put these three propositions up there. So let's just start with money is non-neutral. What does this mean to say that money is non-neutral? What it means to say is that when there's too much or too little money in the economy, that affects the real allocation of resources and therefore the choices that people make. And in particular, this is an important point because many mainstream economic theories argue that money is neutral, that money changes in the money supply don't affect the real allocation of resources, okay? But in fact, they do, and this is the way. This is an important Austrian point to talk about the idea that money affects things in these ways. Okay, so for example, if we have, I mean, if you know a little bit about Austrian theory, right, you sort of know that Austrians have talked about this for a long time with inflation. Okay, that the harm of inflation isn't just that prices are going up. It's that some prices go up a lot, some prices go up a little. If some prices go up a lot and some prices go up a little, those differences between those prices change the allocation of resources. And it means that people respond to those price differentials, move resources in different kinds of ways, and that leads to all kinds of inefficiencies. And importantly, it makes it much more difficult for entrepreneurs and consumers, but especially entrepreneurs, to figure out what those prices are saying. I mean, think back to what we were just talking about, where we were talking about how prices guide people's decisions and inform them of their mistakes and so on. What inflation, and deflation too, but I'll focus on inflation for right now. What inflation does is to mess up that signaling ability of the price system. One way to think about it, it introduces noise or static into that communication system and makes it harder for people to figure out exactly what those prices are trying to say, what they're trying to communicate. And what that means is that entrepreneurs are going to get things wrong more often than they would otherwise. And it reduces the level of economic coordination. It reduces the level of economic growth. All the same is true of deflation. I mean, I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A how deflation might work in this way, but it's the same general story holds for deflation. And the reality is, in the world we live in, of course, in a world of central banks, inflation is a much bigger problem than deflation. And so understanding this is, I think, really important. And you can see also how that might matter for things like the Austrian theory of the business cycle. I'll come back to that in a little bit. So one of the ways in which inflation does its damage is through the capital structure. And our proposition 9 was that the capital structure consists of heterogeneous goods that have multi-specific uses that must be aligned. Okay, what does that mean? Let's break that sentence apart a little bit. First of all, capital is a structure. It's not just a thing, a glob, a pile of stuff. It's a structure. It's a structure that has pieces that have to fit together. You can think of it like a puzzle, like a jigsaw puzzle, where all the pieces have to fit together in a very specific sort of way. And what entrepreneurs try to do is to create and purchase and alter capital in ways so that it fits together with their other pieces of capital and with the capital in other parts of the economy. So the capital, it's a structure, it's a puzzle that has to fit together. What are the pieces of the puzzle? They are heterogeneous goods, okay? It's goods that have particular uses. Not each machine, every machine is not like every other machine. Some machines do some things, some machines do others. As the Austrian economist Ludwig Lochmann said, beer barrels are not blast furnaces, right? They're different things. They have different purposes. You can't just turn one machine into another costlessly, okay? And those machines, those capital goods, and this, by the way, also applies to human capital, right? Have multi-specific uses, which means they can be used for a range of things, but not for anything. So somewhere between only one use and an infinite number of uses is a range of different uses that machines can be put to. And that's important, right? It's not often in mainstream models, capital is assumed to be just this sort of homogeneous glob of stuff like dough that you can just sort of scoop out and apply to a production function and get stuff. But for the Austrians, no, it's like pieces of a puzzle that we have to put together. And how do entrepreneurs do that? For entrepreneurs, okay, their plans, their production plans, make use of specific capital goods for specific purposes. And the idea is to try to fit those goods together as best they can. And this is where all this stuff about prices and calculation and profits fit together. What entrepreneurs are trying to do is to put together a plan, right? And try to put together a plan of production subject to whatever budget that they have, okay? They go out and they execute the plan and they see, did it work? How do they know whether it worked? That's what profit and losses do. If it works, great. If it didn't work, then you maybe have to reshuffle that capital. You have to try a different machine or tweak it differently or try different labor, create a new budget, new plan, do it again, see what profits and losses tell you, and so on. This is the key thing for Austrians. This is what a capital using economy, what capitalism is all about. Is about trying to find out which of the technologically possible ways of producing something is economically the most efficient, right? And that's about combining capital and labor, human capital, in all the right ways, aligning them together to do this. And how do we know how to do that? Prices, profits, losses, and so on. Again, the heterogeneity of capital, this picture of capital as a structure, is a fact of the economic world. It's not, again, it's not just a sort of a claim about politics or something like that, okay? It's how the world works, and it's an important difference with the mainstream. And it has all kinds of implications for policy. For example, when we think about stimulus spending, we can't just assume there's this capital lying around that will do whatever we want it to do, right? There's specific machines with specific uses sitting out there that we have to think about, and specific people with specific skills that we have to think about. So this set of questions, I think, is really important. And then finally, we can talk about the idea of spontaneous order, Proposition 10. Hopefully, I don't have to say too much about this, but understanding that at the most macro level, social institutions, economies, all of these things are the result of human action and not human design. This idea of spontaneous order is central, not just to Austrian economics, but sort of to the history of economics and how markets work without a designer or a controller. But understanding too that doesn't just happen. It happens when the rules and institutions are right. And even those rules and institutions themselves are often products of human action, but not human design, are themselves product of spontaneous orders. Once again, this is, we didn't create the world that we live in, right? We can't construct it from scratch. We can't reconstruct it the way we want it to. We have to recognize that many of the important institutions of our world are things that we didn't design or control, that emerged out of years and years of human practice. Many social institutions are not the result of our reason, of our conscious reason. So when we look at all of these together, right, what I hope is clear is that how all of these are statements about the nature of the world. They're bits of social scientific analysis. They're not in and of themselves policy conclusions. They describe how the world works, okay, all 10 of those propositions. If you understand how the world works, right, then you can start to take the next steps and think about policy conclusions. But as I've said, Austrian economics in and of itself is a framework for social scientific analysis. So let me take my last couple of minutes here. I've got about 3 or 4 or 5 more minutes left, and just say a few words about Austrian economics and libertarianism, and about classical liberalism, if you prefer that term. Why does it matter that we make this distinction between the two things? Okay, well, one, libertarianism, classical liberalism is a political philosophy. It's not an economic theory, okay? Austrian economics, as I've been trying to emphasize, is a social scientific framework. And what this means is that not all Austrian economists are necessarily libertarians, and certainly not all libertarians are Austrian economists. There are plenty of people who would think of themselves as libertarians, including professional economists who are not Austrian economists. For example, you all may be familiar with the work of Brian Kaplan, who's at George Mason. Brian is as radical a libertarian as you'll ever meet, but he's not an Austrian economist. And there's plenty of others who I think would fall into that category. And then there are other people like my friend Roger Koppel, who I think would consider himself to be in many ways an Austrian economist, but doesn't call himself a libertarian. So, and I can think of other colleagues who use important ideas from Austrian economics who are not at all libertarians. So again, I think that we don't want to confuse or treat those two things as if they are the same. That said, right, there's reasons why many Austrian economists are libertarians. And I think Mises laid this out best. He said, look, economics is value-free. Economics alone can only tell you if you do this, this will happen. If you do this, this will happen. The question to get to policy conclusions is, well, what do you want to happen? What do you value? What are your other beliefs? Mises would say, look, if you want a world of peace and prosperity and social cooperation and all of these things, then if that's what you want, then, right, economics can help you understand that. And the way in which economics explains how markets, how unhampered markets work, right, is important. Because if those are the goals you have, keeping markets as free as possible is the way to get there. And Austrian economics helps us understand why that is. But you can't Austrian economics alone. If you're someone who doesn't want peace and doesn't want prosperity, then you know, you can understand economics, but not come to the policy conclusion that free markets are good. Okay, so you need other beliefs. You need to understand the world in other ways to move from Austrian economics to those policy conclusions. And in particular, when we try to interpret and understand history, Austrian economics alone can't do it for us, right? We need other disciplines. We need other kinds of ideas from other places, right? There's no, you know, there's no such thing as doing sort of Austrian history. And I don't use this term in the slides, but I do want to mention this term because it bugs me a lot. You see a lot of people sometimes, you see some people describe themselves as Austro-libertarians, and I really hate that term. I hate that term. Hopefully now you can understand why I might dislike that term so much. Okay, I think people use it. I'm not sure if they mean to say the two things are the same, or they just mean what they're sort of claiming is I'm a libertarian who likes Austrian economics, but it's just an awful term because it confuses these two things in a way that I think is problematic. We want to keep them, they're related, but we want to keep them analytically separate. And I think my last thing here is economics and natural rights. I'll just say a sort of controversial thing here too. Look, if you really deeply believe in natural rights, it's not clear to me what economics does for you. If you think people have a natural right to have private property and do with it what they want, right? No matter what, that's what you mean, right? If that's what you mean, then why do you need to know economics, right? I mean, Mises used to say, if you could persuade him that socialism was more productive and led to more prosperity and more peace and so on than capitalism, he'd be a socialist, right? Both Mises and Hayek did not believe in natural rights the way we hear people, libertarians often talk about them today. They were both, broadly speaking, utilitarians, consequentialists, whatever word you want to attach to it. And for them, what mattered was what the best social institutions are those that lead to really good consequences. Again, peace, social cooperation, prosperity, and so on. So again, you know, it's perfectly fine to be a natural rights libertarian. It always puzzles me when people who say they're economists or who think Austrian economics is great, who also say, well, I believe in natural rights and I'm a natural rights libertarian. I'm like, well, why do you waste your time studying economics then? If natural rights are natural rights, it doesn't really matter, does it? And that's a bit of a straw man. I think there's a more sophisticated natural rights position than that. But still, it's worth thinking about, right? And understanding that the Austrians, Mises and Hayek anyway, were in fact, broadly speaking, utilitarians. So with that, I'm gonna stop. I hope that was a helpful set of ideas to think about with Austrian economics. As I've said, the book is not organized in the way that those 10 propositions are. The book is more sort of historical, but I think over the course of the book, we get to all of those things and all of those ideas. So thank you for your attention, and I guess we will move to Q&A.
Thank you, Steve. We have time now for Q&A, and please, if you can raise your hand in the platform in Zoom, I will give you the opportunity to ask yourself to Professor Horwitz. Then, if somebody wants to raise your hand, because I have a couple of the questions here written in the platform, but okay, I think they're shy at the beginning. Always. But I have here from Jesus Carros. He says, how can we know the ideal amount of money that a country must have? I think he's thinking about Mises and the whole thing, and what the contemporary Austrian says about that, and how to avoid inflation given that, and deflation, especially in these times.
It's a great question, and it's an interesting one because it suggests, suppose I ask, how can we know the ideal amount of shoes that a country must have, right? We would say, well, we don't know what the ideal amount, and we can't know ahead of time what the ideal amount of shoes is. That's why we have markets, right? Competition in the marketplace helps us figure out the number of shoes and the kind of shoes and all that people want. And we have this problem with money because we have monetary systems, we have central banks in which the decision about how much money we should create isn't a decision that we make to the marketplace. It's a decision that's made by either politicians or bankers or so on, or some combination thereof. And so the idea that there's this kind of optimal ideal amount that we have to figure out ahead of time is how we tend to think about money, but it's not how we think about other things, which suggests what the answer is, right? The answer is, if we want to figure out what the ideal amount of money, how can we know? And I think that's a really good way to put it. How can we know that ideal amount? The answer is we need more competition in the production of money, right? And this is one of the arguments, I think, that Austrians have made for why central banks are problematic and why having a competitive system of currency and money production would be better. We can let banks compete with each other to produce the quantity of money that the public wishes to hold. If I can go into the arguments in more detail if people want, but the literature on free banking, certainly the books by Larry White and George Selgin and my own, talk a lot about this idea of how it is that a competitive monetary system would produce the right amount of money, meaning the quantity of money. And for those of us who make these arguments, the right amount of money is to produce the quantity of money that people wish to hold in their money balances, the amount of money people demand at the current price level. And again, that's not really fundamentally different than we think about shoes, right? We want to produce the quantity of shoes that people would demand at the given price, particular price. So the answer, how can we know? In some sense, the answer is we can't, right? No one of us, no group of us can know, no central bank can know for sure what the ideal amount of money is. We would like to produce the quantity that people want to demand at the current price level, but we can't know what that is ahead of time. We can discover it through competition, through the discovery processes of the market, and that, I think, is the answer, which is we come to know that when we allow real competition in the production of money.
Thank you. I have another here. He's talking about the social institution, and he says, it's Sebastián Flores, so every social institution that has been created has actually been a result of people's spontaneous needs? That's an interesting question.
It is a great question. And it goes all the way back to the beginnings of Austrian economics too. Karl Menger, who founded the Austrian school, wrote his book, Principles of Economics, which again was the sort of first one that really laid this out. But he also wrote another book on the methodology of the social sciences, investigations in the methods of the social sciences. And in that book, he distinguishes between institutions that are sort of what he calls pragmatic institutions, which are institutions that are not spontaneously emergent institutions, right? Versus organic ones that have emerged through spontaneous order. And so, for example, not all institutions are spontaneous orders or were created that way. Entrepreneurs create firms very intentionally. We get married and create a family. That's an intentional institution. The institution of the family as a whole is a spontaneous order, but particular families are not. Sports teams are not spontaneous orders. They're constructed institutions and within them, right? We think about how they operate in a spontaneous order. We leave people to sort of make their own choices under a set of rules, and we are confident that good outcomes will emerge if unintended. But we don't do that. Firms don't do that. You don't get to go to work and say, I think I'll do whatever I want today and hope it works out. The boss tells you, or at least there's a set of rules that the boss creates about where you work on any given day. On a sports team, the coach or the manager tells you what to do, and so on. So not all institutions are spontaneous in spontaneous orders in that sense, but big important ones are things like law and language and money and the family and rules and morality and so on. Nobody invented those. Nobody sat down and wrote out, right, all the words in English or in Spanish. Nobody sat down and wrote out the law. The common law in the English tradition emerged out of years and years and years of the sort of accumulation of decisions. So it's really important to distinguish those. And what's cool about markets, right, is that while markets as a whole are spontaneous orders, they're made up of firms and households and individuals, right, that aren't spontaneous orders. And so households are trying to utility, seeking after utility. Firms are profit seekers. They're behaving in very sort of top-down constructed, pragmatic ways. But the way in which they interact in the market produces an outcome that none of them intended. And in fact, if you think about what entrepreneurs do, they can't even engage in the rational planning of budgets and all that stuff. They can't create a kind of pragmatic top-down institution without the use of money and prices and profits from the marketplace, which are themselves part of a broader spontaneous order. So for pragmatic institutions to be effective, we need the spontaneous order of the marketplace, yet it's those pragmatic institutions that create the spontaneous order of the marketplace. And that's sort of, for Clinton, it's, you see where I'm going here, right? If there's a kind of dialectic, almost a hermeneutical circle there, one might say, between the actions of firms and households and then the marketplace. And so I think that it's a great question, and it's really important to understand that not everything is a spontaneous order.
Thank you, Steve. I have another question here from Jose Tomas Peláez. I'm gonna translate it because he wrote in Spanish, and I'm gonna change or add something because he's talking about that Hayek has this clear idea of his theory of knowledge, that we don't know everything, for example, and the knowledge is everywhere in small parts, and that Mises speaks specifically about division of labor. And after that, he's asking if we see some friction between Hayek and Mises. I would say that many people see that on methodological view. Do you think there's a methodological debate between Mises and Hayek? And I would add, we know that Austrian economics is always, and the most part, philosophical, but which philosophy there is, or is there any philosophical school that dominates in the Austrian School of Economics nowadays?
Yeah. Great, all good questions. I just want to point out that my Spanish is good enough that I was able to translate that question pretty accurately on my own. So I'm very proud of myself.
Great.
There's a whole bunch of things to talk about here. First of all, I think the premise of that question is, at least we can challenge the premise. Mises does talk about knowledge and does talk about the division of knowledge. Even in the 1920 article, he has this phrase where he talks about how prices are aids to the mind, right? Even going back to theory of money and credit, he talks about how prices are at one end of a chain of phenomena, the start of which is anchored deep in the human mind. So for Mises, and there's another place in Human Action where he talks about if all the prices disappeared overnight, we'd have to reconstruct all this knowledge. So Mises understood that prices do have something to do with knowledge. He wasn't as explicit and sort of detailed about it as Hayek was. And I think that the reason for that is that you have to remember their work, particularly on economic calculation, was at two different times with two different audiences. And that when Hayek wrote, Mises had already written, right? So what Hayek's doing when he writes in the 1930s and 40s and all this stuff, he's kind of taking Mises's arguments for granted. And sort of, he believed Mises was right. He didn't have to go back and explain what Mises said, but he wanted to expand on it in some important ways. And Hayek was writing for an largely English-speaking audience in the mainstream of economics at that time. The market socialists he was responding to were talking about prices in a particular kind of way in a particular kind of context. Mises was much more concerned with a German-speaking audience who at the time was thinking about abolishing markets altogether. And so they're emphasizing different sorts of things in that debate. So to answer the second question, the question, I actually think that those two arguments are extremely complementary. I mean, Austrian economics is the economics of Mises and Hayek. And as my friend Peter Becky would say, the best reading of Hayek is a Misesian reading of Hayek, and the best reading of Mises is a Hayekian reading of Mises. If you sort of read each of them through the other one's eyes, suddenly all of these things that people think are differences or frictions or whatever begin to disappear. Now, are there differences between them? Yeah, there are, and as Clinton suggested, I think the differences are mostly philosophical about how they would sort of defend the status of economics and the project of economics. So a couple comments on that. The big one is I don't think they matter. I don't think the differences that the philosophical differences that you could draw between them just don't matter that much when you cash them out in terms of economic theory and in terms of what Austrians think economics should do. I wrote a piece, and again, if someone wants to track it down online, you can find it for Cato's Cato Unbound thing on praxeology and the method of Austrian economics. If you search Horwitz, Cato, praxeology, you'll find where I laid out what I think praxeology is and what Austrian economics is, and I think it's something. If Mises and Hayek were both alive, I think they'd both agree with it. At least that's what I was trying to write. Anyway, it was something that they could both agree with. And it's not, again, I just think those philosophical differences are interesting and real, but they don't matter that much for how economics is, for how Austrian economics is done. It matters for how we might describe it, right? And how we might defend it in a philosophical discussion. But I don't think it affects theory that much. And I think that Mises and Hayek, their differences on economic theory were almost nothing. Okay, and I think that's the thing. I think the people who have tried to draw a wedge, put a wedge between the two, and try to separate Mises and Hayek in these ways, especially on the calculation stuff, are just wrong about that. I just don't think it can be held up by the text. I think it's one last point. I think the other difference of emphasis between the two that I think leads people to think there are bigger differences than there are. Certainly Mises much more emphasized the entrepreneur and sort of human action and choice, where in Hayek what you see is the sort of spontaneous order, prices are knowledge surrogates, the broader questions, right? But I think, one, if you look at Mises, you'll find spontaneous order stuff in Mises. Look at his discussion of Menger's theory of the origin of money, where he says it's the method of of economics. And in Hayek, if you look carefully, you'll find the entrepreneur. But Hayek was just assuming, again, that Mises had already said all this and it was right. So again, I think they're much more complementary than the critics, than that group of critics who want to draw that distinction, say.
Okay, perfect. We have another question on Maite Ramirez, and she says, can we know the subjective preference of other individuals and measure their utilities?
Yeah,
that's a good question.
It's a great question, and it's one. The ability to measure utilities has been the sort of dream of many economists going way back, right? If we could only measure. So we can't really measure people's utilities because it's not, again, it's not even a thing. One of the things we talk about in Austrian economics and in mainstream economics too, is that utility is ordinal, not cardinal. And what we mean by that is utility is a ranking, first, second, third, fourth, not how much, right? So when we think about, if we have buckets of water and different things we might do with them, we don't sort of measure how powerful the things are. We say, what's my most important thing? What's my next most important thing? Whatever the gap between them is, we don't worry about. So in that sense, we can't even measure utility. Certainly what Austrians mean by utility is not something that's even possible to measure. But I do want to talk about, can we know the subjective preferences of other individuals? Because that's a more interesting question. So why is it, right, that we get upset when people give us money for a birthday, as a birthday present, right? Why does that bother us when people give us money? We want a present. We don't want money, right? Especially when it's someone close to us, like a brother or a sister or a wife or husband or a parent, right? And I think the answer is that we sort of expect them to know us better than that they ought to be able to get us something that is a thing that they would know that we would want. And those are the best presents, right? The best presents, the best gifts we get are when people buy us something that we really like and something we would have wanted if we knew it existed, right? Or if we really had thought about it. And so in some sense we can. I actually do know the preferences of my wife to some degree, as wacky as they are. I do know the preferences of my kids to some degree, right? And of my good friends. And when I go to buy them a gift, right, what am I thinking? I'm trying to think, well, what can I buy them that I know they'll really like? Okay. So in a household, that's fine, right? A husband, the parents in a household can decide how to allocate resources within the household because they sort of know the preferences and the needs of their children and of them. But once you get beyond the household, you don't know that stuff anymore, right? And most of the interactions we have in the world are with strangers. And it's those people we don't know well enough. And this comes right out of Adam Smith in the very first couple chapters of The Wealth of Nations, right? That human beings don't get to know enough people well enough over their lifetimes to be able to know what it is that they want. So we have to rely, Smith says, on our self-interest. And that's where the famous quote about the butcher, the baker, and the brewer comes in, okay? That we rely on their self-love to engage in exchange because we can't know enough about them to know what it is that they want. And what Smith didn't fully understand, and the Austrians did, is that that's what prices do. It's prices that help us coordinate between strangers, right? The role, all that stuff in Hayek about prices as knowledge surrogates and Mises about prices and calculation is about how we deal with people we don't know, with strangers. Okay, and so we can't know their subjective preferences, but prices help us give us knowledge as if we could. And the other thing, of course, about prices is it's not just about preferences; it's about real scarcity. So, when a storm when a storm destroys a crop or something, right? We need to know that, and prices help us understand that. So that's a really good question. And I think sometimes economists and even Austrian economists say, "Oh no, we can never know other people's utilities because it's subjective." Well, mostly true, but if that really were true, right? It would be difficult to raise children, right, without sort of having a sense of what it is that they want and need, and as a parent, you know that, or at least have a pretty good sense of it. But the problem is it just can't go beyond the household, right? We can't organize a whole society based on knowing each other's preferences. Great question.
Perfect. We have another one that's about money, but I think that was answered with the previous question about the amount, optimal amount of money. I think that you believe that free banking is more efficient than to give the monopoly of printing money to the government.
Yep, same way we would say with any other good, right? We would expect that, Venezuela might be an example here. If we give the government monopoly over other goods and services, toilet paper, shoes, whatever it might be, we wouldn't expect them to get it right. We'd expect there to be shortages, and we'd expect there to be all kinds, and quality would be low and so on. Why would that be different with money, right? We expect to see them not get the quantity right and the quality would be low and so on. I mean, money's a weird good that way, but in some ways, but we'd expect this. Monopolies don't work very well.
I have a very interesting question here, and I think it's from Nicolas Jose Armas, and he says that the presentation started with the statement that the Austrian economics is not only the free market economy, because it also is known for studying human actions and their social implications. So how can we define Austrian economics?
Yeah. So I think you can say that the second half of your sentence actually gets at it, right? Austrian economics, one definition of Austrian economics is understanding human action and human plans and its consequences, both intended and unintended. That would be one way to define it. I might add to that and how those consequences emerge out of different sets of social institutions. So that really gets us into three things. We want to study human action and human plans, right? That's the Mises entrepreneurial thing. We want to understand their consequences, intended and unintended, and that gives us sort of Hayek and spontaneous order. And we want to understand the institutions under which that takes place, and that gives us that kind of comparative political economy. It gives us the calculation debate. It gives us in a way, public choice and Buchanan and all that too. So sort of, I think all of those pieces together, that is human actions, understanding human actions and human plans and their consequences, both intended and unintended, and how those consequences and the sort of how good or how poor those consequences are under alternative sets of institutions. That gets at a lot of it.
Okay, thank you very much. I have another one. Very interesting. I don't understand completely, but I'm gonna try to talk about it. It's Marco Campo. Marco, if you want to say something after me, you are allowed. But he's saying that if not all Austrian economists are libertarians or liberals, how would an Austrian economics doctrine work in totalitarian or communist regime system? I think the question is if Austrian economics not always goes with libertarian philosophy, if it can goes with totalitarian or communist regime system. I think
so, I understand. Yeah, I understand the question. So there's an article, I think it's a Pete Becky article called "Why Are There No Austrian Socialists?" Right, which is an interesting title. And if you go back far enough into Austrian economics, some of the early Austrian, the first generation, particularly Friedrich Wieser, like his second generation, were not super classical liberals. They were saw a much bigger role for government, and they had the same. I mean, if the core ideas about Austrian economics are these ideas about marginal utility and subjectivism and all these sorts of things at the core of microeconomics, right? You could conceivably believe many of those things, and yet still think there's a larger role for government. It's going to be harder right now. It's a little bit harder because certainly what Austrian economics has done is to flesh that out and to really understand. Look, as I kind of said at the end, if you really want a world of peace and prosperity and so on, right? You need these institutions to make that happen, and Austrian economics helps us understand why these institutions make it happen. But again, you could be someone who says, I don't want those things. I just want power, right? If I just want power, helping me. Austrian economics can help me understand all of the things that would be bad to do, right? If all it is that I just want power. That said, I mean, it is, it is true that you can't, two things. Remember, Austrian economics is a set of ideas. It's not a set of policy conclusions. So there's nothing sort of logically contradictory about saying that you can't, for example, you might say, well, how could you be a libertarian and a totalitarian, libertarian and a communist at the same time, right? That mostly doesn't make sense, right? But Austrian economics isn't necessarily a set of conclusions. You might take ideas from Austrian economics and believe that government should have a significant role to play. I don't think you're going to be a communist or totalitarianism in that sense. It's a fair question. It's hard to, why are there no Austrian socialists is not the same question as why are there no Austrian dictators or right. So yeah, it's certainly the case that if you understand Austrian economics, you're going to shy away from the very end of the spectrum. But where exactly you end up, you don't have to be, just because you think Austrian economics is great, you don't have to be a radical libertarian. You can still, there's debates about various things. I mean, and again, I think if you read Hayek, particularly The Road to Serfdom and Constitution of Liberty, Hayek, the role for the state that Hayek allowed for in those two books is much bigger than what we normally associate today with libertarianism, that's for sure. And even in some ways with people who would call themselves classical liberals, Hayek thought government had some significant roles to play. And allowed it to play those roles pretty, he thought they were justified in those two books. What's interesting, what's great about Hayek, by the way, and we should all be this way, Hayek actually got more radical as he got older. And that's cool, right? Because if you read Law, Legislation, and Liberty in the 70s, he's like, no, actually, I don't think so. He's much more radically libertarian in the later books and toward the end of his life. And I tell one Hayek story. I never had the chance to meet Hayek. He died before I got into grad school and all this stuff. But there's before I got into grad school, he was old and ill by the time I was. But anyway, when Hayek visited the States back in the 70s, he met with a number of young time, young Austrian economists. These are people who are now sort of the senior people. And they were talking about all kinds of stuff. And they asked him about anarchism. And they said, you know, Professor Hayek, what do you think about libertarian anarchism? And Hayek kind of smiled and he said, well, you know, he's in his 70s at the time. And he says, well, he says, look, I'm an old man. He said, I can't, you know, I can't sort of, I can't be an anarchist and an old man. And he said, I just, you know, the way I was brought up and the way I was trained. He said, but if I were a young man today, these ideas would be really interesting and fascinating to me. And I'd probably be sort of very attracted to them. Right. And I think that's a great answer. Right. And so, you know, I think there's all kinds of places you can fall on a big hunk of the political spectrum and still think that Austrian economics is useful. I think you're right, though, after a certain point, you know, communism, totalitarianism, just not going to work.
Okay, perfect. I have another question that is interesting because I have many questions interesting, but there are a couple of that talking about the money. But there's another that is interesting about this topic. Javier Lopez says, how would you differentiate a liberal from a libertarian? Are they the same thing? Obviously no. And if it is, who would be closer to the Austrian economics?
Okay, so let's do the differentiation. Then we'll, I think the way I like to think about it is libertarians are a subset of the broader liberal or classical liberal. And I think we differentiate them by just how much they role, what size role they think the state should have, that government should have. So libertarians are in that sense radical liberals, more radical classical liberals. I think you can be, for example, classical liberals might give the state a bigger role with military, might give it a bigger role, might have more role for sort of social, larger role for social welfare, things like that. Might all kinds of, there's a few other things I can think of where they might, you know, give the state more things to do, where libertarians would be more skeptical of that. You could be a classical liberal, for example, and still support a central bank, I think, if it were a sort of rule-bound central bank. But a libertarian, that's the kind of thing where you're going to say, no, government shouldn't even do that. So if you think of it as a liberal as a circle, libertarians are, you know, a circle within the circle of more radical folks. But I think the second question is kind of the point I want to make today. It's not a matter of either one being closer to Austrian economics, because Austrian economics is something different from that, right? You could be a classical liberal and be an Austrian economist. You can be a libertarian and be an Austrian economist, because Austrian economics is about how you understand the world, not the conclusions you have about what the role for government should be in and of itself. Austrian economics is compatible, again, with a range of different roles for government, at least, you know, within a range, okay, of different roles for government. And it's the Austrian economics is the tools we bring to understanding the world. It's not what we think the world should be. Maybe that's a better way to put it.
Yeah, that's good. And I think it's the last one because of the time. This is interesting. What approach we should have to the research in the economic science? Does the Austrian thinking is the kind of like the base for developing an economic thinking? I think he's asking a question about if you can use Austrian economics for developing economics. I think so.
So a couple of things. I think that, I don't know if anyone linked it or not, but that essay at Cato that I mentioned earlier about praxeology lays out some of this sort of what does an empirical Austrian economics look like? What does it mean to do research as an Austrian economist? And I think that's a really, really great question. For me, what Austrian economics is particularly good about is doing economic history, is telling better stories about historical events. We have a set of ideas, this framework that we bring, that lets us see things in history that other economists might not see. And so we can, and we have ways of linking them that can tell different and better stories than other economists. And I think what, you know, if you go on and get a PhD or go to graduate school and, you know, get a PhD in economics and have to find things to write about, the way to think about it for me is the following, is to think, look, what are the questions that mainstream economists are interested in? What are the puzzles they're trying to figure out and solve? How can I, as an Austrian, look at those same questions and look at those same puzzles and come up with a different set of answers to them, a different explanation for them, using the tools of Austrian economics. To me, that's the best way to think about that research. And for Austrians, what's that going to mean? Well, one, it's going to mean we're going to think about subjectivism and the choice of individuals. We're going to think about the role played by the price system and the inability of the price system to help people coordinate their behavior. We're going to look for different sources of evidence. You can use statistics and econometrics if you want. There's nothing un-Austrian about using them, right? But what Austrians would say is we want to look at other kinds of evidence too. We want to look at what historians would call primary sources. We want to go back and see what were politicians saying and doing, what were people saying and doing, all of those kinds of things, right? All those sort of non-quantitative bits of evidence that might be relevant to this. And we bring all those things together with our theory, we can tell different and better stories. I think one of the best examples of this, I don't think I'm going to have the time in the near future to do it, but I would love to write a book on the Great Depression, right? That takes not just the Austrian theory of the business cycle, but a whole bunch of other things related to that and brings them together and tells a different story about some of the issues there. If you're interested, by the way, in the Great Depression and different stories, George Selgin has been doing a 7-part set of blog posts at the Cato Monetary Project on the New Deal. And if you're interested in the Great Depression and monetary theory and fiscal policy, those are definitely worth your time. But I would like to do, those are the kind of things that we can do well, is to use our particular theory and our understanding of the world to tell different and better stories about historical events. And notice, historical events includes really recent history. So we can talk about not just the Great Recession and the financial crisis, we can start to talk about COVID and all these other things, right, as historical events in the same sorts of ways. So I don't know if that answers the question or not, but that's how I think about doing research.
I think so. We are in the end of the conference because the time is up, but I would like to say thank you to you, because it has been a great time listening to you, and we have from this conference, we have new projects with you. Good. Because it's really interesting what you just said. And I think the information that you provide with your book and all the videos and all the information is going to be really valuable for them. Thank you very much, Steve. And thank you very much, all of you guys, for being here. Keep safe, and thank you very much.
My pleasure. And thank you all. Great questions, and glad to see so many of you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you, Clinton.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Marilyn.